My name is Emma, and I'm a 33-year-old architect. I specialize in sustainable design and have built a career from the ground up, but I never expected my family to show up at my doorstep after 6 years of silence. When they did, everything I thought I had moved on from came rushing back. But before I get into that, let me take you back to the beginning, to my childhood. I grew up in a small suburban town in Connecticut. My dad, Robert, was a corporate lawyer, and my mom, Linda, worked as a high school teacher. We were comfortable, nothing too extravagant, but we had enough. I had a younger sister, Sarah, who always seemed to be the center of attention in our family. For as long as I can remember, everything I did seemed to fall into the shadows of her presence. I was the responsible one, the good one, the one who never needed attention, while Sarah was the rebellious, fun one who could do no wrong. Looking back, it was as if my parents had decided that I would always take a back seat to Sarah's needs. She was the artist, the dreamer. I was the practical one, the achiever, and the one who often put my own dreams aside to take care of things. I excelled academically from the start. Straight A's, honors classes, and the occasional science fair win. Yet none of it ever seemed to matter as much as Sarah's whims. She could fail a class, break curfew, or flunk a test, and my parents would make excuses for her, blaming her teachers, her friends, or anything else but Sarah herself. Meanwhile, my achievements went unnoticed. When I was accepted into a prestigious summer program in high school, my parents took money out of my savings to pay for Sarah's art supplies instead. I remember feeling like I didn't matter to them, like my efforts and my future weren't as important as whatever it was that Sarah wanted at the time. Things took a turn when Sarah hit her teenage years. She started dating a guy who was clearly troubled, and the rebellion ramped up. My parents, instead of stepping in, continued to focus on her and make excuses for her behavior. They turned a blind eye to everything I was accomplishing and growing into. It wasn't just about grades anymore. I was trying to figure out who I was, what I wanted, and what was important to me, but they never seemed to care. Instead, I became the de facto caretaker, the one who was expected to step in and fix things when Sarah's choices went wrong. My parents would lean on me, asking me to help out with Sarah, to make sure she was okay, even when I had my own responsibilities to take care of. When Sarah failed her driver's test for the third time, it was me who was expected to take her out and practice with her. When she got into trouble at school, it was me who had to make excuses and help smooth things over. My own wants, my own dreams, took a back seat. I never asked for this, but it was expected of me. I never really had a chance to be just me. I was always the good one, the one who took care of everyone else. I'd learned to carry the weight of my family's expectations without complaint, but the older I got, the more I realized that carrying this weight was exhausting. The emotional toll it took on me was far more than they ever acknowledged. It didn't help that, by the time I was 18, Sarah was pregnant. I remember that day clearly. It was a Sunday afternoon when she dropped the bombshell. Sarah was 17, still in high school, and had no clear plans for her future, let alone a stable relationship with the father of her child. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was shocked, but the other part of me, the part that had been silently watching this spiral for years, wasn't surprised at all. What followed was a blur of bad decisions and strained family dynamics. My parents were so caught up in Sarah's pregnancy that they completely ignored me. They told me I had to move out because there wasn't enough space for me with the baby coming. No conversation, no attempt to figure things out. I was expected to just pack up and leave. I don't know what hurt more, the fact that I was being thrown out or that they didn't even give me a choice. They cut off my tuition funding for college to support Sarah. They didn't even give me a heads up. One day, I just received an email saying the money was gone. At the time, I was applying to universities and had hoped to attend a well-known school for architecture. But suddenly, everything was different. I had no support, no financial help, and no place to go. The hardest part was when they refused to help me with housing. I ended up living in my car for months, trying to keep up with my studies while working 2 jobs to survive. I still don't understand why they couldn't just support me through that time. How could they prioritize Sarah, who had made so many poor decisions over me? I had always done everything right, always been the one they could rely on, but when I needed help the most, they were nowhere to be found. In those months, I had no one, no family to lean on, no friends who could truly understand what I was going through. I was alone, and yet I kept pushing through. I didn't give up on my dreams. Somehow, I still managed to graduate with honors, got into a university, and later, I went on to build a career as an architect. But it didn't come easy, and the scars of those years still run deep. I'm successful now. I'm an architect at a firm specializing in sustainable design, and I've worked hard to get where I am. I'm engaged to Nathan, a fellow architect who understands the demands of my career. We've built a life together in Boston, a life I'm proud of, but my family's absence, or rather, their treatment of me, still lingers like a shadow, always there, always haunting me. And then 6 years later, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I was in the middle of a project, a deadline I couldn't afford to miss, but something told me I should pick it up. What followed was a conversation that shattered the fragile peace I'd built for myself. It was my mom, Linda. The hardest part wasn't the years of silence. It was the point when I realized just how far my parents were willing to go to protect Sarah and her choices, even if it meant sacrificing me in the process. The moment they cut off my future, was the moment I knew I was never going to be the person they wanted me to be. I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was a means to an end, a tool they used to maintain their family's image and to make Sarah's mistakes disappear. It started when Sarah, just 18 years old, found herself pregnant. I knew it wasn't planned. It wasn't even a surprise. It was just another consequence of the chaos that always seemed to follow her. But when my parents made it clear that I was the one who would have to bear the burden of helping Sarah, I felt my world crack. They turned their backs on me the moment she needed them most. They pushed me out of my own home and sent me off to fend for myself, so Sarah could bring her boyfriend and baby into the house. They didn't care that I was just a teenager myself, with a scholarship to college hanging by a thread. They didn't care that I had my own life ahead of me. They just needed me to disappear for a while so they could fix Sarah. I fought for months to keep my head above water. I knew I couldn't go back to Connecticut, not after what they'd done. But at that age, what else could I do? I didn't have enough money saved up for an apartment, and the rent in Boston was absurd for someone just starting out. So I made the impossible decision to live in my car. There was no space in my parents' house anymore, no place for me to stay. They didn't want me there, and I couldn't bring myself to ask for their help after everything that had happened. For the next few months, I bounced between odd jobs, anything I could do to survive and somehow keep my grades up. I worked as a barista, as a waitress, and sometimes even as a cleaner at night. The exhaustion was overwhelming, and every day felt like I was running on fumes. But I pushed through. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them see that their decisions had broken me. I'd been used to being the responsible one, but this was different. They expected me to sacrifice everything for Sarah. But I wasn't going to. Not again. Still, every time I closed my eyes at night, the pain of what had happened threatened to swallow me whole. I would go days without talking to anyone in my family. My phone would sit there, silent, while I lived in a sort of numb isolation. I still remembered how it felt to be a little girl, wanting my parents to be proud of me, wanting them to see me for who I was, not as the perfect child or the sacrificial one. But those days seemed so far behind me now. I couldn't even recognize the person I used to be. Somewhere between working my third job and studying for my finals, I finally snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I remember sitting in my car one night, the engine off, just staring at the streetlights outside, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. And yet, somehow, I managed to push through. I graduated with honors, barely hanging on, but I did it. They never even called me to congratulate me. That's when it really hit me. I wasn't just building a career, I was building a life from the ground up, without the foundation of a family. I was doing it on my own, and somehow, I knew that was the only way forward. When I finally had the chance to start my career, it felt like breathing for the first time in years. I had a chance to prove to myself that I could make something of my life without relying on anyone else. I worked my way up, putting in late nights and early mornings, pushing through the exhaustion because I had no other choice. Slowly, the pain of what my parents had done began to fade into the background, replaced by the feeling of accomplishment and independence. I was no longer their daughter. I was Rebecca, a woman making her own way in the world. Still, no matter how much success I found, I couldn't outrun the wounds they had left behind. The deep, gnawing ache that had been building since my teenage years never quite went away, but I thought I had it under control. I had no time for them and no interest in going back to that suffocating environment. And for a while, that worked. I buried myself in my work, and in the future I was trying to build, I found a sense of peace in my independence. I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. I wasn't waiting for them to come around. But then, just as I thought I'd finally put the past behind me, my mother called. It felt like being hit with a ton of bricks. The timing was uncanny. Just when I thought I was far enough away from all that pain, it found me again. She called, casually asking about my life, sounding so interested in what I was doing. For a split second, I let myself feel like that little girl again. I shared about my work, my promotion to senior architect, and even about Nathan, the man who had become my rock. And then the real reason for her call surfaced. Like the hidden poison it was, they needed me to move back to Connecticut. Sarah's kids were too much for them to handle, and my father was retiring soon. They had decided it was my responsibility to step in and take care of her kids. The audacity of it. The same people who had cut me off without a second thought, who had thrown me out when I was at my lowest, now expected me to drop everything for them. They expected me to sacrifice my life, my career, my future, my relationship with Nathan, for their mess. I didn't even let her finish. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not coming back. Not now, not ever." And I hung up before she could say another word. I thought I'd be relieved, but instead, I felt a tight knot in my stomach. Over the next few days, the calls and messages came flooding in. Aunts, uncles, and distant relatives, all telling me I was heartless, telling me that family helps family. It was the same line they had always used when they wanted me to sacrifice, but I had nothing left to give. I had already sacrificed too much. Nathan was supportive. He didn't question my decision, didn't try to talk me into anything. He just stood by me, which is exactly what I needed. He understood the depth of my pain because, in many ways, his own family was just as complicated. His quiet understanding gave me the space to process everything without feeling pressured to act. But as the messages kept coming, the guilt started to creep in. Was I being too harsh? Could I do more? I wasn't sure, but I wasn't ready to give them a chance to hurt me again. I couldn't ignore it, though. Something inside of me still wondered, had they really changed? Has anything truly changed? Would this be the same story all over again? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to find out the hard way, and so I stood firm. The door was closed, and yet the past kept knocking. After that conversation with my mom, everything seemed to spiral again. It had been 6 years since I had heard from her, and the shock of hearing her voice brought back a flood of emotions I thought I'd buried. I was prepared to leave all that behind me. I'd worked so hard to rebuild my life. I didn't need them, and I certainly didn't want to relive the pain of what they'd done. But when she called, I couldn't help but listen. I remember hanging up that day, my hands shaking as I set my phone down. Nathan, my fiancé, was sitting on the couch watching me with concern. He could see the fight in my eyes, that part of me that was still angry, still holding on to the years of neglect and abandonment. But he also saw the part of me that still cared, the part that wanted to believe in the idea of family, even though every experience with mine had taught me otherwise. Nathan and I had built something real together. We met during my early years in architecture, both of us working in the same firm, both of us drawn to sustainable, environmentally conscious designs. He'd been a breath of fresh air in a life that had felt stagnant and suffocating. With him, I could be myself without judgment or expectation. He saw me, not as the dutiful daughter or the fixer of everything broken, but as Emma, the person. Our relationship had grown organically. He understood the weight of my past but never tried to fix me. He gave me the space to heal, to breathe, to become someone who wasn't defined by family trauma. He stood by me when I closed the door on my parents, and he supported me when I decided to walk away from all the chaos they'd caused. But now, with my mom's call, everything was different. I didn't know what to do with the emotions flooding back. I wanted to protect what I'd built, my career, my relationship, and the independence I'd worked so hard for. But I also knew that ignoring them would mean continuing to carry that baggage forever. The pain of the past had a way of lingering, even when I tried to bury it under the weight of my accomplishments. Nathan, ever the grounding force in my life, suggested that I take some time to think it through. He made it clear that whatever I decided, he'd be by my side. No pressure, just support. I spent the next few days in a haze of conflicting thoughts. I went to work, met with clients, and spent hours drafting plans for a new project, but my mind kept drifting back to my family. I hadn't heard from them in years, and now they were suddenly back in my life asking for help. But help with what exactly? As my mom explained in her call, they wanted me to move back to Connecticut. The reason? My sister, Sarah, was struggling. She had 3 kids now, each more difficult to handle than the last. Her life, as I'd expected, had spiraled even further out of control. She'd gone through multiple failed relationships, and her most recent one had left her emotionally shattered. My parents, tired of the mess Sarah had created, were desperate for me to come home and take care of things. They claimed it was my responsibility as the successful one. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother's voice was laced with a kind of manipulative urgency that I'd grown so familiar with. "You've always been the responsible one," she said, trying to tug at my sense of duty. "Sarah needs you now more than ever. You've always been the one who could handle things. It's time for you to step up." I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to remind her that it wasn't my job to clean up after Sarah, that I had already sacrificed so much of myself for their family. But I bit my tongue. I didn't say a word, just sat there in silence, the weight of the request sinking into my chest. In the end, I told her no. There was no way I was going to uproot my life in Boston for the same toxic, manipulative dynamic that had nearly destroyed me in the past. I'd fought too hard to build my career, to create a life that was my own, without the constant pull of family drama. I refused to go back to Connecticut, not for Sarah, not for anyone. But the calls didn't stop. My mom left dozens of voicemail messages, some pleading, some guilt-ridden, but they all had the same underlying message. "You're the only one who can help." I felt like I was being suffocated by their expectations. I ignored it all, focusing on my work, on Nathan, on the life I had chosen for myself. Then, 2 weeks after my mom's call, I got a text from my aunt. I'd heard nothing from her in years either, and now she was sending me angry messages accusing me of being heartless. "Family helps family," she wrote. "You can't just abandon them when they need you the most." It was the same old narrative. The responsible one should always sacrifice for the others. But I wasn't going to play that game anymore. I had nothing left to give, and I wasn't going to be their scapegoat again. Nathan was supportive as always, as he didn't pressure me to make any decisions, but he could tell how much it was eating away at me. "You're not the bad guy here," he said, holding me as I broke down. "They've had their chance, and you've already given them so much. You've built a life, Emma. Don't let them take that away from you." His words grounded me, reminding me that I wasn't responsible for their mistakes, that I had worked for everything I had, and it wasn't my duty to rescue anyone anymore. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I received a message that caught me off guard. It was from Sarah, the last person I expected to reach out. It wasn't an apology. No, it was a plea. She told me she was getting help now, that she was in therapy and wanted to change. She said she recognized her mistakes and needed her sister more than ever. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope, like maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point. But that hope quickly faded when I realized I had seen this pattern before. Sarah would promise change, and then, inevitably, fall back into the same destructive behavior. I felt torn. On one hand, I wanted to believe in her. I wanted to believe that people could change. On the other hand, I had learned the hard way that promises from Sarah and from my parents were often empty. I couldn't afford to be fooled again. I needed time to think. The guilt was starting to seep in, but I had to remind myself that I had nothing left to give. I had worked too hard to build a life that was mine, and I wasn't going to let them destroy it. It's funny how life has a way of turning everything upside down. Just when I thought I had finally distanced myself from the past came knocking. Or rather, my parents came knocking. After 6 years of radio silence, they decided to pay me a visit. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to just ignore them, keep moving forward with my life. But another part, the one I thought I had buried, was curious. What could they possibly want after all this time? Were they finally going to acknowledge the damage they'd caused? Or was this just another manipulative plea to get me to help with their mess? They reached out to me through an email first, asking if we could meet in person. It was brief, almost businesslike, which somehow made it worse. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the 6 years of silence, just a vague, "We need to talk." I'll admit, I was on edge. But Nathan, who had been my rock through all the chaos with my family, convinced me to meet them. He could tell I was conflicted and suggested we set clear boundaries. I agreed, though I was nervous as hell about what was coming. We decided on a neutral spot, a quiet cafe in downtown Boston, where I could control the situation. I made it clear that I didn't want them anywhere near my apartment. I needed them to understand that they couldn't just walk back into my life without any respect for the boundaries I had set. Nathan agreed to stay nearby in case I needed support, though I wasn't sure I'd actually call on him. When they showed up, I was surprised at how much they had aged. My dad, Robert, looked tired. His once sharp suit hung loosely on his frame, his usually steady gaze seemed distant, and there were deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. My mom, Linda, was quieter than usual. She always had a way of filling the room with her presence, but this time, she looked fragile. Their faces were drawn, like they hadn't been sleeping well, and I couldn't help but wonder if their guilt had aged them prematurely. We exchanged pleasantries, but the tension was palpable. I sat across from them, trying to read between the lines of their behavior. After a few minutes of awkward silence, my dad began speaking. His voice was shaky, almost apologetic, but it was the kind of apology I hadn't expected. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. Instead, he started talking about the past, not just the things they had done wrong, but the things they had kept from me. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase, and my heart dropped. Inside were several documents, photos, letters, and what looked like detailed financial statements. But what caught my attention immediately were the journal entries. I thought I must be mistaken, but there they were, pages filled with neat handwriting documenting my life from the moment I left Connecticut to the present day. My father had been tracking my every milestone, my promotions, my awards, and even my architecture projects. Every major event was recorded in this journal. It was eerie. He'd been following my career, silently, without ever reaching out. He looked at me, his eyes searching for some reaction, but I didn't know what to say. He had been watching from a distance all these years, and it felt like a violation. He didn't know me anymore. He knew the version of me he had imagined, the version he had built in his head, and yet he had never been there when I needed him the most. "I kept track of everything, Emma, every success you had," my dad said softly. I didn't know how to fix things, but I couldn't stop thinking about you, about how we failed you. I couldn't reach out, but I couldn't just let it go. "I'm sorry, I should have been there. I was wrong." His words hit harder than I expected. Not because I wanted them to, but because I was forced to confront something I had buried deep inside me for so long. The idea that my father had been haunted by his actions, just like I had been haunted by the consequences of their neglect. He had never been able to admit his mistakes until now, and it was both unsettling and strangely validating to hear him say it. I looked at my mother, expecting to see the same defensive, guilt-ridden expression I was used to, but instead, she was crying. Softly, almost imperceptibly, but her tears were real, and that was what shook me the most. It wasn't an apology or the journal. It wasn't the money they had saved for me, which I'd honestly never asked for or expected. It was the fact that my mother, the one who had always stood by my father's side, was now acknowledging that everything had gone horribly wrong. Through her tears, she finally spoke, her voice cracking. "We were wrong, Emma. We focused on Sarah and we ignored you. We saw you as the strong one, the one who could take care of herself, and we let you do it alone. We shouldn't have. We didn't see how much you were hurting." She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I was so fixated on Sarah and her needs that I didn't even see what I was doing to you. I am so sorry. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For years, I'd believed that they didn't care, that I was just the person they took for granted, the one who would always be fine. But sitting there across from them, watching my mother's raw emotion, I realized just how much guilt they were carrying. It wasn't enough to undo the years of damage, but it was something. It was real. They weren't asking me to forgive them, not exactly, but they were finally acknowledging that their choices, their failure to see me, to see my struggles, had consequences. And that, in itself, was a huge step. It wasn't long before they got to the real reason they were there. They weren't asking me to move back, to take on Sarah's kids, or to step into the caretaker role I'd played for so many years. They were asking for help, but not in the way I had expected. They wanted my help finding a psychiatric facility for Sarah. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a condition they had hidden from me for years, and her mental health had deteriorated after multiple pregnancies and failed relationships. They weren't asking me to fix her. They were asking me to help her get the treatment she needed. They were also asking for my help with the custody battle over Sarah's children. Sarah's ex-husband was fighting for full custody, using her mental health struggles as leverage, and they were worried about her ability to care for them. They wanted me to help them navigate the legal and medical aspects of this crisis, but they weren't expecting me to shoulder the emotional weight. As they spoke, my emotions were all over the place. On one hand, I was relieved. They weren't trying to pull me back into the chaos of their lives in the way they once had. But on the other hand, it felt like too little, too late. I wasn't sure what to say or what I was even supposed to feel. They were acknowledging their failures, but that didn't change everything that had happened. I had come into this meeting with a guarded heart, and nothing had changed. Their words didn't undo the years of pain or neglect. They couldn't make up for everything I had endured, but for the first time in my life, they were asking for my help without making demands on me, and that was something I wasn't sure how to handle. After my parents' visit, I needed time to process everything. Nathan was a rock, helping me sort through my thoughts. He reminded me that I didn't need to forgive them on their terms or timeline. Healing was my choice, and I had to go at my own pace. I decided to help them professionally, but I kept a firm line when it came to personal involvement. They needed assistance finding a psychiatric facility for Sarah, so I reached out to colleagues in mental health to make sure she got the right care. I made all the arrangements, but I kept my distance emotionally. I wasn't going to dive back into the chaos of their lives. When it came to the money they'd saved for me, I made another decision. My parents had secretly set aside money, thinking it would somehow make up for everything, but I couldn't accept it as a personal gift. Instead, I turned it into a trust fund for Sarah's kids. It wasn't for me, it was for their education, a chance to give them a better future. I agreed to manage it, but I set clear boundaries. I would handle it professionally, but I wouldn't become emotionally entangled. Nathan helped set up the trust with his financial contacts, ensuring the fund would be managed properly. I didn't want to be directly involved in their day-to-day lives, but I did want to help them move forward in a meaningful way. The most surprising part was how my parents changed. My mom started respecting my boundaries, calling less and only when necessary. My dad, after years of silence, sought therapy and sent me a formal apology. It wasn't perfect, but it showed a level of self-awareness I hadn't seen before. With those changes, I felt a shift in how I saw my family. I wasn't ready to let them fully back into my life, but I could acknowledge their efforts without sacrificing my own peace. This wasn't full reconciliation, but it was a step toward a healthier dynamic. After everything that happened, it feels like I'm in the middle of two worlds. My old life, the one I fought so hard to leave behind, is still there, lurking in the shadows. But there's this new life I've built with Nathan, my career, and the peace I've worked to preserve. I don't want to go back to the chaos, but I also can't ignore what's happening. Ashley is improving, slowly but surely. After the accident, her mental health was the biggest concern. The doctors put her on the right meds, and she's more lucid now, though she still has a long road to recovery. The baby's out of the NICU, healthy and strong, which is a relief. I think the kids will be okay, but I don't want to get too attached. It's not my place to step in as their caretaker. Nathan and I talked about everything, and he's been so supportive. He saw things I couldn't. The way my father can't look me in the eye, the way my mother now asks permission before sharing anything with me. It's like they're learning to respect boundaries for the first time. I've decided to keep my distance but help professionally. I used my connections to help find a psychiatric facility for Ashley here in Boston, but I won't be involved in her daily care. I also arranged for the money my parents saved to go into a trust for the kids' education. I'm their trustee, making sure it's used for the right reasons. But I'm not jumping back into that mess. The kids deserve better than what they've been given. Charlie's drawings and Lucas's laughter remind me of that. I'll stay in touch, but on my terms. I've set boundaries that protect me, but also give the kids a chance at a better life. Nathan and I are moving forward with our wedding plans. My family will be invited, but the ceremony will be filled with the people who supported me when I needed it most. It's not about forgiving everything, it's about creating space for healing, for me and for the kids. This is the start of a new chapter. It won't be perfect, but it will be mine.